Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're just waiting for a couple of minutes to allow our audience to join in, and then we will start this training session. So if we could just wait for a couple of minutes to allow everyone to join in, and we should be starting shortly. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Like I said earlier, we're just giving ourselves a couple of more minutes. We can see a number of people are logging on right now. And hopefully we should start in the next couple of minutes. Thank you for your patience again. Thank you very much for your patience. Quite a number of people have joined, and so we think we will now proceed whilst others may also join. Uh, Good morning once again, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Amin Musa, and I head our projects and infrastructure practice at Anjawala and Kana. The purpose of this session today is to discuss public-private partnerships, especially given the increasing importance we are seeing being placed by many governments, including the Kenyan government, on financing infrastructure through public-private partnerships. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join this discussion, and I hope we can add value to the conversation around how we structure public-private partnerships and what possible value can be derived from structuring transactions of this nature. We have structured our training program over a period of several months, given, frankly, the complexity of this subject. We felt to do proper justice to understanding PPPs, it will require getting a fairly detailed understanding of, from a legal perspective, what the various contracts are that make up a bundle of the PPP agreements and the project agreements, and understanding each one of them in some degree of detail so that we can understand what these individual contracts do, how they interact with each other, and most importantly, and you will be hearing these words quite often during our discussion, how they deal with risk allocation. Because risk allocation is, in my view, probably the most fundamental skill that practitioners in this field need to understand. And by practitioners, I mean government, private sector, lenders, lawyers, regulators, because understanding risk, identifying risk is fundamental to effective and successful public-private partnerships. The purpose of the session today is to simply have an overlay of the key topic of PPPs, an introductory session today, and then going forward, we will look at the individual contractual arrangements in much more detail. A number of my colleagues will be participating in this training program over the next few months. So we will, for example, look at how sponsors come together who provide equity funding to infrastructure projects and what their contractual arrangements are around equity structuring. We will look at the fundamentals of the government project agreements. What does the project agreement look like? What does the concession agreement look like? What do the implementation agreements, or as we in Kenya call them, letters of support, what do they look like? What do they cover? We will also be looking at construction contracts, operation and maintenance contracts, finance agreements, and then what many people perceive to be ancillary contracts, but in my view, increasingly becoming hugely important in the overall structuring of PPPs. And what I'm referring to is arrangements and contracts relating to tax, land, environment, and community issues. And we find increasingly these issues are becoming just as fundamental as a project agreement or a construction contract is to the successful structuring of a PPP. And therefore, within A&K, we work very closely with our real estate teams, our tax teams, to deeply understand tax issues, environmental issues, land issues, community issues. And so This will form part of our overall training program, and we hope all our various members of the audience, whether you may be in the legal field, whether you are with government as regulators, as off-takers in state corporations, whether you are in the private sector as developers and equity providers, whether you are lenders, because ultimately a public-private partnership is fundamentally about getting this ecosystem together to talk to each other, to understand each other, to enable us to put together what are fairly complex transactions. So to start with, what is a public-private partnership? In essence, this is a transaction where government and private parties get together, pursuant to which the government allows the private party to develop a public asset or to be able to provide what is essentially a public service. And typically this is structured through a long-term concession or project agreement, which then allows the private party to earn a return and allows the government to pass on certain risks that it would normally take and pass on those risks to the private party. That in essence is what we call a public-private partnership. Therefore, the key elements of a PPP structure will involve a long-term contract with government, typically 20 to 30 years, depending on commercial issues and also depending on the law. The law may have restrictions on the term of what a project agreement or a concession arrangement can have. And so it's important to factor in both the commercial considerations and the legal and regulatory considerations when looking at the term of the contract. As I said earlier, the purpose of PPPs is for private parties to undertake what are typically public services or to provide public assets. These will typically be in the energy sector, in the transport sector, but increasingly we are seeing what I would call PPPs being structured in non-traditional sectors like government housing, waste management, healthcare and education. And therefore, as both private parties and governments are getting more innovative on how they structure PPPs, we are increasingly finding PPPs not only dealing with the traditional sectors like energy and transport, but moving away to some of these more unique, non-traditional sectors. The fundamental issue around PPPs, as I said earlier, is risk allocation and how risk is allocated between the various parties involved in the various contractual arrangements is fundamental to putting together a well-structured PPP. The other key element of a PPP is ultimately, how does this private party who is essentially providing a public asset or a public service, how does he make a return? How does he get paid? Is he getting paid by government? Is he getting paid? Is he getting paid by an end user? And so it's fundamental to understand that. So the starting point, having understood the basics of what a PPP is to understand who are the potential counterparties to a public-private partnership. Typically, you will start off with a project sponsor who represents the equity of the project, that either as a response to a government request for a proposal to develop a certain infrastructure, or through a privately initiated proposal, a group of sponsors who want to develop a project will get together to respond to a government request for proposal, or to put forward their own proposal to government about undertaking a PPP project. Typically, these sponsors will set up what we call a special purpose vehicle that will constitute the project company. And the project company will be the legal entity that ultimately undertakes the project. There will typically be local law restrictions on where this project company can be incorporated. It is not unusual for local laws to require that the project must be incorporated in the country in which the project is being undertaken. In addition to that, the other key party to a PPP is the government. And that can take many forms. It could be the sovereign government, the national government, by that I mean. It could be regional governments. So for example, in Kenya, we're starting to see counties developing PPPs. And in fact, our regulatory framework in relation to the PPP laws are being amended to cater for the possibility of counties undertaking PPPs. PPPs can be undertaken by state corporations like Kenya Power, or other entities incorporated by statute like Kenya Kura for road projects. So in addition to the fundamental private party and the government, you have a host of other parties that are fundamental to structuring a PPP. You need lenders to provide debt financing to the project. You need a contractor to build the infrastructure asset. You need an operator to operate and maintain the asset after it is built. And you have a host of other parties like hedge providers, insurers, that overall form what I call this ecosystem of relevant fundamental parties to a PPP project. I guess the key question to ask ourselves as part of this introduction to PPPs is, why is this currently the rage, not just in Kenya, but in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in many emerging economies around the world in Asia and Latin America? As you may all know, traditionally, infrastructure projects were built and financed by the government. That is typically the traditional procurement method of procuring infrastructure projects. So if you look at it from a Kenyan perspective, all the roads that have been built and are operating today have been built through that traditional procurement structure. Our standard gauge rail in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Ethiopia, has been built through that process. This is a process where the government effectively looks for a contractor to build a project. The government then pays the contractor for the project. The government might either pay this contractor through funds set aside under a budget, or they can in turn take out loans from other commercial banks. They can issue infrastructure bonds. They can borrow from multilaterals like African Development Bank, the World Bank, to be able to pay for the asset. The issue we are having with many countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is this procurement structure essentially means that if the government doesn't have the cash available to pay for it through an allocated budgetary process, and if they have to borrow this money, this debt goes straight onto the national balance sheet of the country. And as a result of that, it prevents government from undertaking other development activities, whether it is in health, whether it is in education, or other sectors. And so one of the primary objectives of government looking into PPP projects is to say, how can I find another party who can not only build the project, but they can finance that project on their own balance sheet, and so that the cost and the debt of building this infrastructure does not sit on the balance sheet of government. Typically, that is the primary objective of government in considering PPPs. The second objective for government is the value for money proposition. In an ordinary world, if the government was extremely efficient in being able to construct projects, one could argue that it would make sense for governments to continue to use the traditional procurement structure to build projects, because frankly, the cost of financing from the government sector is a lot cheaper than the cost of financing from the private sector. However, I think many of us have seen projects that have been undertaken directly by government that have had significant cost overruns, that have seen significant delays. And so another government objective in considering PPPs is whether the private sector will be more efficient in building the infrastructure from a cost and time perspective. And frankly, if they are not efficient, that risk sits with the private sector. And that is another key third objective of government, is how much more risk that we normally take as government in building infrastructure, how much of that risk can we pass on to the private sector? And typically construction risk, especially where governments are not being efficient in building infrastructure themselves, how can they pass on that risk and that debt to the private sector? And these are some of the key objectives that government have in deciding whether they use traditional public procurement versus the relatively new public-private partnership structure. There are a number of different models that are available in structuring PPPs. We won't go into too much detail on these because, frankly, the types of structures can vary considerably. But in summary, many of you may have come across terms like concessions, acronyms like BOOT. And so what do these mean? A concession arrangement is effectively a contractual arrangement between government and the private party, where the private party is given a license, a contractual license to develop, operate, and maintain an infrastructure project. But you can have many variations to this, and the various acronyms like BOOT or BOO goes to give you an understanding of what the structure is in relation to the PPP project. So what we call a boot project will involve the build, the owning, the operation by a private party, and potentially later the transfer, which is the T in the boot, the transfer of the asset back to government. But you have many varieties of the structures, and you could have a BOO, which is a build, own, operate, that doesn't have the transfer element back to government. In addition to that, there could be projects where you are developing or rehabilitating existing assets. In other words, these are not what we call greenfield projects where nothing exists on day one and a project has to be built from scratch. But a rehabilitation project could involve, for example, an existing port, but that requires significant upgrade, and therefore pursuant to a rehabilitation concession that is granted by government, a party takes over existing assets, rehabilitates them, and then owns and operates them. And therefore, there are very many varieties of this basic structure, depending on the nature of the infrastructure and what the government objectives are. We will now move to, frankly, what is my favorite topic when it comes to PPPs and project finance, and this is risk allocation. As I said earlier, I think understanding risk as a practitioner, whether you're in government, private sector, lender, lawyers, insurance, is fundamental to being able to put together a well-structured PPP. It is the ability to identify a risk firstly, understand that risk, and then manage and allocate it appropriately is key to PPPs. And the standard principle that all sound practitioners use in understanding this very complex area is, ideally, in an ideal world, risk should be allocated to the party that is best able to control and manage that risk. This simple one-line principle, in my view, is fundamental to getting a better understanding of the more complex issues around risk allocation. So what do we mean by risk and risk allocation? The starting point is to identify risk. You take a project and you ask yourselves, depending on which side of the table I sit, what are these risks? And remember, depending on whether you are government, whether you are the private party, whether you are a lender, whether you are insurance, how you react to risk can be very different. How you manage that risk can be very different. But the starting point must be the ability of all parties to identify the risk. There are many projects that we have seen that have failed, frankly, quite miserably, is because, surprisingly, all the parties put together failed at the very initial stage to even identify some fairly fundamental risks. On typical standard projects, the typical risk issues that will arise include the following. The first one is the ability to build an asset as per specification, within budget, and on time. This is what we call completion risk. And like I said earlier, one of the key reasons government want to move from traditional public procurement to PPPs is because many governments have come to appreciate and understand that sometimes they are not best placed to handle what we call completion risk. This ability to build on time at the right quality within budget is sometimes better placed with the private sector, who do this routinely, potentially all over the world. And so the government wants to pass on completion risk to the developer. And then it is now up to the developer to understand, how do I manage this risk, given the fact that this risk has now been passed on to me, the developer, by the government. And there are various structures around how you do that. There are a whole variety of subsectors under completion risks that need to be considered. One of these key subsectors would be construction risk. And so typically a developer will try and pass on as much construction risk as possible to his contractor. And we will look at in the next sessions of this training program how developers structure construction contracts. Specifically, EPC contracts are generally used as construction contracts for project finance transactions. And we will explain to you how developers pass on a fair amount of construction risk from themselves, having received it from government, and how they pass it on to the contractor. The developer will also want to consider operational risks. This is typically another risk that the government passes on to the private sector, and the developer, having received this risk, needs to figure out, how do I pass this onwards potentially to a third party? There may be instances where the developer says, because of my experience in operating these assets, I will take on that risk and I will not appoint a third party to operate these assets. But if the developer is not comfortable in operating these assets because they lack the experience, they will typically appoint a third party operator under what we call an O&M agreement, another contract that we will look at in more detail in the later stages of this training session. The other fundamental risk that an off-taker is going to have to consider is what we call market risk. So if you take a look at the standard gauge rail project, which is developed through traditional procurement, market risk sits with government. If people use the rail or don't use the rail, that market risk sits with government. So the question is, if the government decides under a PPP model to pass on that risk to the private sector, how does the private sector manage that risk? Does the private sector enter into what we call take or pay off-take agreements, where somebody else guarantees to take the service and pay for the service? Or does it rely on the ultimate end user, which could be the citizen, of the country or the residents of that country to directly pay for that service, and therefore the private developer is taking what we call market risk. There are a number of ways to structure these transactions, but understanding market risk and how you allocate market risk and manage market risk is another one of those fundamental risk allocation issues that must be considered in significant detail, both by government and the private party. In addition to that, there are credit risk issues for all the various counterparties that need to be considered. The government will need to consider whether the private party they have appointed actually have the financial capability of bringing this project to life, to actually developing and building this project. It is therefore not unusual in many instances for the government, in addition to doing a due diligence on the credit risk of the developer, demanding financial guarantees from the developer, especially in the event the developer is unable to fulfill its commitments. The developer, in turn, has his own counterparties, contractors, operators. Does the contractor have the financial capability of constructing the project? And what if they run into trouble? And so, again, it is not unusual for developers to seek performance guarantees, advance payment guarantees, and other financial securities to get more comfortable around the credit risk of their counterparties, like the contractors and the operators. And once again, when we look at the individual contracts, we will look at these issues of securities and guarantees in more detail, and what we have seen in the market in terms of how you structure these security and guarantee arrangements. If the project is dependent on receiving certain inputs, like fuel, whether it may be steam, it may be diesel, it may be biomass, how do we ensure that the project is able to receive these inputs so that it can operate efficiently? So it's not unusual for supply or offtake agreements to be signed, whereby third parties are guaranteeing supply of this input to the developer. There are risks associated with cost increases, financial risks that need to be considered by all parties. What if the local currency devalues? Who bears that risk? Is it the government? Is it the developer? Is it the contractor? What if interest rates go up or down? Who bears that risk? And how do you mitigate that risk? And again, we will look at some of these mitigation remedies, whether they are hedging arrangements or whether they are contractual risk allocation structures that allow counterparties to manage this risk. To give you an example, in the power sector, the issue of currency risk is managed through a regulatory process by which the end consumer, the user of the power, ultimately takes foreign currency risk. So if you receive your power bill, probably to your annoyance, you will see a charge that is called a forex charge. And every time the shilling devalues, a charge is placed on the ultimate consumer, which money then goes to the off-taker, which is Kenya Power. And the reason that happens is, in many cases, Kenya Power has a power purchase agreement with the developer, but the tariff is denominated in a foreign currency. You are seeing significant debate, not just in Kenya, but across sub-Saharan Africa, about who should bear foreign currency risk. Should we, for example, have local currency PPAs rather than US dollar or euro denominated power purchase agreements? And frankly, that is a very fair question. But what I always say to especially government and regulators is there is no such thing as a free lunch. So on one hand, you can convert your contracts into shilling contracts, but bear in mind that there is a possibility that that may result in an increase in tariff, so that that increase in tariff can deal with the foreign currency risk. In my view, the simple risk lesson that I always bear in mind when structuring a transaction is that you cannot wish away risk. You can only manage it, or you can only mitigate it. You cannot make it disappear. And that's why I think it's very important when there are conversations between public sector and private sector, that very frank and honest conversation about risk is had. Because like I said, you cannot make risk disappear. You need to agree on how you manage and mitigate that risk. In addition to that, you have risks like political risks that are another hot potato item in relation to who takes political risk. What is political risk? Political risk typically involves things like expropriation by government, actions of government that potentially frustrate or kill projects, change in law events, change in tax events, and therefore you will typically have a fairly hard-nosed negotiation with government about what constitutes political risk, which portion of political risk will the government bear, which portion of political risk will the private party bear, and can that private party pass on that risk to a third party like an insurer? In the diagram that we have put in front of you, we have set out what I call a traditional risk allocation structure that in some sectors we used to see 10 years ago. In some new sectors of PPPs, that may still probably apply. And I think you can see just visually where traditionally the risk primarily sat. And that was with government. Government, notwithstanding the fact that it went through a PPP process rather than a traditional procurement process, found itself still taking the lion's share of risk. Now, I must say, some people argue that simply on its face, that is unfair for government. My view is that in certain sectors where you are starting this process, if you think about the power sector 15 years ago, when this country was facing blackouts and there was a desperate need for private sector intervention to provide power plants so that we could supply the country with power, it was not unusual in those cases where there was no track record of what we call the IPP model, the independent power producer model, where there was no track record, and therefore government still took a fair amount of risk. They would take political risk, they would take risk in relation to land, development and use of transmission and distribution systems, In many cases, they would take fuel supply risk. They would take certain economic risks in relation to foreign exchange, interest rate changes, and by and large would take all political risk. The developer, on the other hand, would effectively take the risk of building the asset on time and on budget. They would ensure that they take the technology risk, the financial risk, the operational risk. And like I said earlier, if you look at the power sector 15 plus years ago, it made sense for the government to pass on this construction and operational risk to a third party so that we could have generation plants providing power to this country. But the government still maintained a fair degree of risk, as you can see in this chart. Having said that, as sectors develop, as governments develop track records, successful track records, you are now finding governments negotiate away from the traditional risk allocation structure. And so in our experience, we have had very interesting conversations with government, and in my view, in some cases, rightfully so, where government says to the private party, we would actually like to have a conversation about certain types of risk that either we believe we are not best suited to take on the risk, or because of our track record, our very successful track record, we believe you, the private party, should take on more risk. And we are increasingly finding this conversation. And I think as long as this conversation is held in the right spirit, it is held with a clear understanding of risk, I believe, frankly, this is a healthy situation that occurs between private parties and public sector. Because if you do not have this conversation, in my view, actually, what generally happens is the government loses faith and confidence in the PPP model, and they revert back to the traditional procurement model. We have frankly seen that in many countries in Africa, where in countries like Tanzania, in Ghana, the governments rightfully or maybe wrongly believed that they got the short end of the stick on certain PPP projects and frankly decided to abandon in some sectors, or if not all sectors, the PPP model and go back to the traditional procurement structures. And in my view, I don't think that kind of situation helps the industry. It doesn't help government. It doesn't help the people of the country. It doesn't help the private sector. So I think we are all for having a sensible conversation about many issues that you see in the middle of these two circles, and where you have government asking, for example, are we government best placed to take terrorism risk? And so the question both government and private sector should be asking is, well, is there a third party insurer that is capable of taking insurance, that is capable of taking terrorism risk? And actually, if we can find that, but understand that there is a cost. The moment you move away from self-insurance by the government to taking insurance by the private party, there is a cost. And that cost will be reflected in the ultimate tariff or the fee that is being charged by the private party to either the government or to the direct end user. So as long as you have that open and frank discussion, there are areas of mitigating some of these risks. So we have seen, for example, conversations with certain governments where the private sector says, as long as this risk is insurable, we will find a private party to take on that risk. We will pay that private party to take on that risk, but we will add that cost into our financial model. But if in the future that risk becomes uninsurable by the private party, then we would like to have a conversation with government about how we deal with this risk. If you take the example of transmission risk in relation to power projects, you now find a hybrid solution under our feed-in tariff policies and regulations, where it is the obligation of the private party to build a transmission interconnection that connects to the existing grid. So there is a portion of transmission risk that has been passed on to the private party. However, the private party says, once I have built this infrastructure, we should then transfer it to you because I do not have the regulatory ability to operate a transmission line. I will then transfer it to the relevant government authority. And then at that point in time, the risk passes from the private party to the government in relation to the operations and maintenance of the transmission infrastructure. And in this way, we find very interesting conversations that are going on between private parties and government around how to manage and deal with some of these risk areas. Like I said, ultimately, I think it's in the benefit of all parties where government enters into a transaction where they have fully understood the basket of risks, they are comfortable with the risks they are taking, and they are comfortable with the risks they have passed on to the developer, because that ultimately is what will allow this sector to develop further, where we will see more and more projects develop in this manner, and therefore allowing the government to free up resources to potentially use in other areas like health. If you think about the impact the COVID pandemic has had, not just on the economy of the country, but on the government budget. And therefore, increasingly, government is having to make difficult decisions about where to allocate taxpayers' money. Next. Oh, back. So with that, we come to the end of our conversation and our introduction. We hope you found this useful. Actually, sorry, I think I have a little way to go. Sorry about that. We'll actually look at very briefly, look at project finance and understand how project finance is now dealt with. We will look at this concept in much more detail in our later trainings and understand how we structure financing. On PPP projects, financing by and large comes from two parties: the equity parties that form the sponsors and the developers, and the debt financiers who provide various forms of loans, senior lending, mezzanine financing, and typically these are ring-fenced through the special purpose vehicle, and therefore we refer to this as non-recourse project finance. And we will understand these structures in much more detail in the later stages of this training program. So many times we are asked, what is the difference between project finance and corporate finance? Isn't this, in fact, the same thing? There's a fundamental difference actually between the two. And typically project finance is what is used to structure transactions in the infrastructure and the PPP space. And the reason for that is these tend to be non-recourse transactions. What do I mean by that? In these situations, if the project company is unable to pay, the lenders have no recourse to the sponsors and the developers. Now, there may be some exceptions to the rule whereby sponsors and developers are required to provide what we call equity support. But typically that equity support is not a full-blown guarantee of the obligations of the project company. And in those situations, that's what we call non-recourse finance. And because it is non-recourse, the lenders and the equity providers look at the contractual structure in great detail. Because lenders have no recourse ultimately to equity or the sponsors, they need to ensure that the risk allocation package works very well, that the contractual documents are robust and deal with the various risk allocation structures, because frankly, if something goes wrong, they have no recourse, or they have very limited recourse to the sponsors of the project. On a corporate finance deal, it is not unusual for full-blown corporate guarantees, bank guarantees, and other collateral to be provided to secure the lenders. Secondly, as I had explained earlier, the project company typically in an infrastructure project is a special purpose vehicle. In other words, a new company that has been incorporated solely to undertake one project. In other words, their balance sheet is frankly nominal at that stage. Unlike an operating company that will already have cash flows, that will already have assets, that will already have a strong balance sheet that a lender can rely on, typically the lenders will also not be able to rely on the balance sheet of the project company. Hence, once again, the importance of the structure and the contractual arrangements of this transaction. There are a number of other differences around the security package, the fees, the tenor. Project finance deals typically have a much longer loan repayment period than a corporate finance. And so, because infrastructure and PPP projects typically use non-recourse project finance, the robustness of the structure, the robustness of the risk allocation, the robustness of the contracts is fundamental to get lenders comfortable to lend money on a non-recourse project finance basis. And so, as we explained earlier, the ecosystem of the various counterparties to a project finance transaction will involve, firstly, your project company that is typically owned by the sponsors and the shareholders. They will have contracts with government, with suppliers, with contractors, with operators, and very importantly, with all the lenders and the various financing parties. To end this discussion, I thought it'd be useful to show you a live example of a transaction that we did many years ago acting for the sponsors. And I'm sure many of you are aware of and know of the Lake Turkana wind power project, a 300 megawatt wind project that has been constructed and is currently operating in Marsabit, one of the first renewable projects in Kenya, and a highly complex project given its size, given its scale, given its remoteness, and for other reasons. And if you look at this contract structure that we have on the screen, you can get a sense of how many different contracts we had to deal with as the project company, how many different counterparties we had to deal with, and how we tried to ensure that these various contracts talk to each other in a suitable way, and that the lenders who sit on top of the slide, lenders like African Development Bank, Proparco, FMO, would ultimately get comfortable with the risk allocation structure and the contracting package. So you see government contracts in relation to the power purchase agreement, the letter of support. You see various construction contracts. So in this case, a very unique structure of construction was used. Instead of having a single EPC contract, the project company had multiple EPC contracts with various parties. Further to that, you had an ancillary project that was being developed by the government, and that was the development and the construction of the transmission line that was almost 400 kilometers long. And so you had two concurrent projects that had to work together. And that is part of the uniqueness, in my view, of this project. But I hope this pictorial representation gives you some idea of how complex these transactions can be. In addition to that, we have also put forward a pictorial representation of another project that we acted on. This is a heavy fuel oil project developed by Triumph Power. Actually, the reason we have this representation is to explain and show what we started to see at the very beginning. At that time, this was many years ago, what we call the Chinese phenomenon to infrastructure projects. What do I mean by that? So if you look at the transaction structure of this project, in those days, this was unique in some respects from a sub-Saharan Africa perspective. And in fact, in some respects, it was unique from a global perspective. And like I said, I think this was one of the very first projects where you saw Chinese involvement in terms of lending and construction to infrastructure and PPP projects. It was typically unheard of for Chinese contractors to be involved in PPP projects. They may have been involved in traditional procurement projects, but in East Africa, generally, traditional contractors from Europe, America, etc., were used. This was certainly, in my view, one of the first in East Africa in having a Chinese contractor undertake a construction contract under a PPP arrangement. Since then, obviously, we have seen a huge number of contractors get involved also in PPP projects. In addition to that, this project was unique in that it was probably one of the first times in sub-Saharan Africa that the debt financing came from commercial banks, and there was no DFI lending. By DFI, I mean development financial institutions like African Development Bank, CDC, IFC, etc. These are the traditional lenders of money to infrastructure projects. They still constitute a majority of the funding that comes into infrastructure projects. But this was the first time, I believe, in sub-Saharan Africa that an infrastructure project was fully funded by commercial bank money. And more importantly, by a Chinese commercial bank, ICBC in this case. What was also unique about this project is at that time, together with a couple of other projects that were being developed, in East Africa, the MEGA political risk insurance guarantee was developed with the World Bank, and an IDA partial risk guarantee was also developed with the World Bank. In addition to these products being fairly unique at that time, it is my understanding that it was the first time on a global basis that a Chinese commercial bank, ICBC, received the benefit of a World Bank guarantee. And therefore, like I said, I think this project shows how the infrastructure space has changed so dramatically with new entrants to the markets. Now, not only just from China, but also from other countries like Turkey, countries in Latin America, etc. And so we see this space evolving further and further as new and more interesting players bring their input into structuring these very complex arrangements, but that allow countries to benefit and its citizens to benefit if they are well structured and they provide value for money to the country and to the citizens of that country. I believe with that, I have actually now come to the end of my presentation. And like I said earlier, we will have, following this presentation over the course of several months, many more detailed presentations around the specific aspects of PPPs. But I hope you found this introductory session helpful to give you a basic understanding of what we mean by PPP transactions and what is involved in a general sense of putting together these transactions. With that, I think we are opening the floor to questions and answers. If you can just give us a minute or two to gather our thoughts and see what questions we have received, and then we can have a short response period to the audience. So if you could just give us a couple of minutes, thank you very much. So I see a few questions have come through, and I must admit they're actually quite interesting. The first one being, what does the government of Kenya's risk tolerance in PPP projects look like today? In one way, I guess the simple answer is, if you go back to that earlier chart where we had a list of issues in the middle between those two circles, I think that summarizes where I see government risk tolerance being. I think there are certain areas where government has been successful in moving risk across from the traditional government risk bubble to the developer risk bubble. An example of that I'd given is terrorism risk. Earlier, 10 years ago, it was fairly standard for government to take this risk. We have recently come up with structures where government has passed on that risk to developers, provided that risk is actually insurable. Will the government go a step further and say, actually, the insurability risk even should sit with us? That will be an interesting conversation. Governments are looking at reducing their exposure to forex risk. And I always say to government that whilst you can consider pushing forex risk to the developer, it comes at a cost. In my view, it is impossible to get the same fee or tariff on a Kenya shilling basis versus a US dollar basis. If something costs $10 under a US dollar structure, it's not going to cost the equivalent in shillings. Why is that? Firstly, financing arrangements in euros and dollars tend to be cheaper from an interest rate perspective. Secondly, the tenors, the length of the loan tend to be much longer, which also reduces the financing cost. So if you look at a Kenyan shilling loan, is typically being charged at 12 to 15% versus a 5 to 7% US dollar loan. You can get 15 years and in some cases 20 years US dollar loans. You will struggle to go above 7 years. In the rare cases, you can get 10 years loan. All of this adds to the cost of financing and to the cost of the project. So this needs to be a conversation between government and the private sector about which of these risks should sit where, and for the government to appreciate that the more risks are passed on to the private sector, who may be willing to take that risk, there is a cost. Just like the insurance cost for terrorism, somebody has to bear that. So we do see a change in the government risk tolerance appetite, and we expect to see some very interesting conversations around these issues in the middle. Are there instances where multiple counterparties sit on government side? If you looked at the Lake Turkana wind power project structure, multiple counterparties sat in that structure. You had the government of Kenya under the letter of support, you had Kenya Power, you had Ketraco that was involved. We are looking at infrastructure projects, for example, in the water sector, where in many cases those are even more complicated, and you have even a larger number of government entities involved, from the national government to the county government to what we call local WSPs. You have WASREB, you have WARMA involved. And so increasingly, as some of these sectors get more complicated, we are definitely seeing multiple counterparties, government counterparties, in many of our projects. Given the amount of time we have, I will limit this to the last question, which is a very interesting one around COVID pandemic. And we have seen a very interesting phenomena in relation to the COVID pandemic. In many respects, the pandemic was unforeseeable. There are some, frankly, who argue that it was in fact foreseeable, but I think most of us generally agree that this pandemic was completely unforeseeable, and it has had a huge impact across project finance structures. It has had impacts on projects that we were involved in that were under construction. You had contractors that were delayed because of COVID. You had government off-takers who are concerned whether their ultimate consumers had the money to pay them because of COVID, and therefore would they be able to pay the private party? And therefore, how did COVID impact government payment obligations? Uh, on transactions that were still not yet under construction, but getting to financial close, obviously we had very interesting conversations with contractors about specifically how you deal with COVID risk. We have probably spent 6 to 8 months negotiating fairly complex structures around COVID-19 with regards to contractors, with regards to government, with regards to logistic companies, because this is probably the biggest issue you can face today, in addition to the more traditional issues in dealing with PPPs. COVID is certainly a new issue that you must be prepared to understand. You must be prepared to understand how you mitigate that risk, how you manage that risk, and how you allocate that risk. Because if you're unable to do that, you will have very nervous counterparties. Government will be nervous, lenders will be nervous, contractors will be very nervous. And so it's important that you're able to package this very new phenomenon and risk in an appropriate way that gives comfort to all the counterparties. Given the time limitations we have, we will come to an end to our Q&A session. I want to thank, first of all of you for participating in this training session. I also want to remind you once again that this is not certainly the totality of our training session. We have a next training session coming up in November to deal with equity structuring issues, joint development agreements, subscription agreements, shareholders agreements, because like I said earlier, typically the starting point is for sponsors to come together and then move on with discussions with governments, contractors, etc. So we hope many of you, if hopefully not all of you, will continue to follow this training program. And in addition to the Q&A, if you have any other feedback for us in relation to the delivery, in relation to your ability to register, log in, etc., if any of you have had any challenges, please do email myself or my team. And once again, we look forward to seeing you to the next session. Thank you very much.